Welcome back! In our last lesson, we started learning about conditional statements in JavaScript, and we focused on the if, else, and else-if statements. So in this lesson, we're going to continue focusing on conditional statements, and we're going to focus on the switch statement. So to get started, if you can go ahead and go into your project folder, go into the 24-switch folder, go into the start subfolder and open up main.js. Then in your browser, if you can go ahead and open up the index.html page, you should go ahead and see switch on the page. So the switch statement is pretty cool because it can be used to perform different actions based on different conditions. So we saw before, we could use the if and else statements to run lines of code based on if a condition was true or false. And switches are pretty similar because what it does is it allows us to evaluate expression and then run certain blocks of code based on certain criteria. So the first thing you need to do with a switch statement is we need to use the switch keyword. So we're going to go ahead and do switch. So after you specify the switch keyword, next we need to do our open and closing parentheses, and then we need to do an opening and closing curly bracket. So in our parentheses, we need to specify the expression that's going to be evaluated. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in the number 3. And then inside our curly brackets, this is where we can specify our test cases. So this is the criteria that we're testing. So to specify these, we use another keyword called case. So we do case followed by the value that we're testing. So I'm going to go ahead and do 1, and then you go ahead and do a colon. And then on a new line, you'll go ahead and put in the code that you want executed, code to execute, and then finally you end that with a breaks, and then finally we end this with another keyword, and this keyword is called break. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another case statement. I'm going to go ahead and do case 2, and I'm going to go ahead and copy these 2 lines of code here and place them here, and then finally I'm going to do case 3 and then paste those here. So what's happening here is in our switch statement, we're going to have some type of expression. So right now our expression is set to the number 3. And what's going to happen is our code's going to start evaluating this expression against these test cases. So first, we're going to see if 3 is equal to 1. And because it's not, it's going to go ahead and skip this case statement here. So similar to if statement, because this is false, this code is never ran. Next, we come down here, so it's kind of like our else if block, and we check to see if it's equal to 2, and because it's not, these lines of code will never run. Then finally we come down here, almost like another else if statement, and we see that 3 is equal to 3, so we will run this code here. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and add a console log, and I'm going to go ahead and console log the number 3. And then what we'll do is I'm just going to add that console log to each of these statements, and I'm going to go ahead and do 1, 2, and 3. So I'm going to go ahead and save and refresh my page, and what you'll see here is in our console log, we only see the 3 ran. And that makes sense because 3 does not equal 1, 3 does not equal 2, but 3 does equal 3, so we go ahead and execute this. So as I mentioned, these are kind of like our if, else if statements. So you may be wondering if there's like an else equivalent, and there is. So it's usually best practice for your switch statements to include a default block. So your default block is treated like our else statement. So if none of these are true, then this default block is going to go ahead and run. So similar to other ones, we'll have our lines of code to execute. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a console log default ran. So one thing to note is in your default block of code here, you do not need to include the break statement, and we'll come back to that in 1 second. So if we go ahead and save and refresh, we should see that 3 is still ran. So let's come up to our expression and change this to a 4, and we'll go ahead and save and refresh. And now you'll see that because none of these statements are true, we fell back to our default statement and we ran this line of code. I'll go ahead and switch this back to a 3. So what the break keyword is doing is it's basically telling our code to break out of our switch statement and to stop processing. What I mean is right now when our 3 is evaluated, we get to here and we do our console log, and then we call break to signify that, hey, we found a statement that matches, and now we can exit and stop processing everything else. If we do not specify that break statement, what happens is our code kind of falls through, and it's going to go to the next statement and execute regardless if that statement is true or false. So to see an example, if we go ahead and remove that break statement and save and refresh, you'll see our console log 3 ran, but then our default went ahead and ran as well. And so this is great if you intend to do that type of behavior. However, it can cause bugs in your code if it's not something you meant to do. So to see another example, let's go ahead and comment out our break statement here. And let's go ahead and change this to a 2. And we'll see what happens is this case statement is false, so this lines of code do not execute. We get here, it evaluates the true, so this runs, and because we didn't break out of our code, everything else starts executing no matter what the test is. So that's why we have console log 3 and then console log default ran. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and add this break statement back here. So another cool thing with switches is we can group our common code blocks together if it's doing the same thing. So for example, let's say I wanted to go ahead and add a case statement for 4 and a case statement for 6 and a case statement for 8. And all I want to do in these is I just want to go ahead and do a console log. I'm just going to say even number, and then I'll go ahead and add a break statement. What's happening here is when our code gets to this case statement here, it's going to basically test for all 3 of these, and if any of these are true, then it's going to go ahead and execute our code here and break out of our code. So for example, if I go ahead and change this to a 4, if we go ahead and save and refresh, you'll see none of our other statements are true, so now we get down here, and then we go ahead and we execute this line of code because that evaluated to true. So just a few things to note about switch statements is your default block of code does not need to be at the end of your switch statement. However, if it is not at the end of your switch statement, then you need to make sure you include the break keyword. Otherwise, everything will be evaluated, default will then run, and if there's no break statement, it will go ahead and execute all of the other code that was inside the other case statements. If you have multiple cases that evaluate to true, then only the first case is ran and executed. So for example, if I had case 1 here and case 1 here, only this case would run and execute. And the last thing is, as I mentioned before, the default statement is not required. If you do not include it, what will happen is your switch statement will process all of your case statements, and if none of them are true, it'll exit out and then continue to your next line of code.